Welcome everybody. Today we are either in the fifth or sixth lecture in the series. This presentation was originally developed in 2014, and it has an unusual life in all the presentations I've given through all the years. This one has an unusual life. I was actually asked to talk at a food conference in Santa Fe. So this lecture, believe it or not, is attached. I have over 400 publications, but only one of those publications is a recipe. And I'm in with some of the finest chefs in New Mexico and the greater Southwest. And it's Matt's Meatballs, Beans, and Peaches, because I had to submit a recipe because it was a food conference for the book that went along with the conference. So this is the only talk, and I do not talk about meatballs. Don't worry, we're not going to be talking about meatballs, beans, and peaches. This is the only presentation tied to a recipe I've ever done, because as most people know, I don't cook. This is the Matt's Meatballs, Beans, and Peaches lecture, or as it's probably more affectionately known as Agricultural Ingenuity and Expertise amongst the Jemez people. So last time we talked about the Jemez province and the history of Jemez province as a whole. Today we're gonna like narrow down our focus quite a bit. So if you look at the Jemez Mountains as a whole, you know, and you look at the pictures I'm showing here, we're showing rocky crags, narrow little valleys. It's a strange place for agriculture. And yet the Jemez Valley, the Jemez Mountains, this area in and around Jemez Historic Site has some of the earliest evidence of corn growing in the American Southwest, in New Mexico. And if Spanish settlers are to believe, that the early explorers, this area managed to feed a population of 30,000 people. Now that might be a gross exaggeration, but the takeaway, as we talked about last time, is there was a lot of people here. And how is that even possible? I mean, we would not think to grow corn in the Jemez Mountains today. How did they do it? And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. We're gonna focus on three different things, as it were. The first one we're going to talk about is how agriculture gets into the American Southwest. And we're going to look at it through a specific example from the Four Corners, which is probably how Jemez people who originated in the Four Corners got agriculture. So we're gonna step outside the Jemez Mountains and look at the Four Corners for a minute or two. And then next we're going to talk about how they moved agriculture into the Jemez Mountains and how they developed what they did. And then lastly, we're going to look at how the system breaks down, because they're not growing corn in the Jemez Mountains today. What happened? Why is there no, when you look up at Virgin Mesa, why don't you see fields of corn today? We're going to talk about why that is. So we talked about this last time. These are the major periods of occupation in the American Southwest. You have your Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Pueblo, and Historic periods. Now the Paleo-Indian period, they were just hunters and gatherers. And in fact, we talked about the archaeology of hunting in an earlier lecture. It makes sense. Why do people start primarily as hunters and go to primarily gatherers and then go to agriculturalists? Well, if you think of it in broad terms, if you want to think of it as like a hunter, almost anything you can kill the flesh of an animal, you can eat. So if you see a furry, rodent-like creature running around on the landscape and you kill it, you can probably cook it up and eat it. That's not the case with plants. So most animals, if you just looked around at the site, looked around at the world and you said, I wonder if I could eat that. The answer to most animals is yes, you can. If you look at all the plant resources in the world, if you look at all the trees and all the grasses, and you wonder as a human being, can I eat that? The answer to most of those is no, you cannot. It takes humans longer time to figure out what they can and cannot digest as far as vegetative matter on the landscape. But eventually you get into the fact that humans kind of settle, that populations grow, people tend to focus on plant resources. This period in the American Southwest, this transition to focusing on plant resources, is known as the Archaic Period. It's late in this period that people adopted agriculture. And in the Four Corners, amongst the Four Corners Anasazi, the Four Corners ancestral Pueblo peoples, we call this tradition, this time frame of the Archaic, we view it in terms of the Oshara tradition, which is a cluster, a culture that kind of develops and changes through the Archaic period. Now, the Oshara tradition really was developed as a concept by Cynthia Irwin Williams out of Eastern New Mexico University. And the most important thing to think of as far as the archaic, specifically in the Four Corners and in New Mexico, is that what she demonstrated was a transition from Paleo-Indian hunter and gatherer, primarily hunter, all the way to Pueblo agricultural peoples. And what she demonstrated was continuity. So it doesn't look like a new group of people migrate up from Mexico. So a lot of old archaeological texts in a lot of different parts of the world, we explain a lot of differences in terms of migrations. Why did the Roman Empire fall? We may point to Germanic peoples migrating into Europe as one of the causes, or new technologies coming in with new peoples. We do that all across the globe. In this case, in the American Southwest in particular, she demonstrated that the people who'd been there since Paleo-Indian times, you could track little incremental changes in their culture through time. There didn't need to be an explanation of new peoples coming in from Mexico. Certainly new products were coming in from Mexico, from the Mexico region, but it didn't mean that they were replaced. The people who lived there during the Paleo-Indian period were replaced. Moreover, that has huge connotations towards other ideas that somehow some of these Paleo-Indian hunters and gatherers came from Europe, they were Solutrean peoples or whatnot, whatever ridiculous kind of idea you apply yourself to. You don't need that. You can easily explain how people came up during the Paleo-Indian period, established themselves in New Mexico, and continue to live all the way up until present day. So the Native American peoples you see at Jemez Pueblo today are likely the very same peoples that lived during the Pueblo period, were the same peoples that lived during the Archaic period. They may have moved around some of the landscape, but the same, you don't have a huge new group coming in. You're looking at the same group of people. Their culture has just changed. And so the Oshara tradition is broken into 6 phases, and you can see those listed here. We're going to go through each a little bit real quickly. But the main thing is you'll notice that with each change, it's so incremental that it doesn't even look like much of a change if you live during those time periods. And these time periods are hundreds, if not thousands of years of time. So let's look at them real quick. You start with the J phase. It's the most similar to Paleo-Indian peoples. The flagstone technology revolves around the atlatl, which you can see this guy pitching here. But it really, the marked change, the change from the Paleo-Indian to J phase, starts with a transition to a drier climate. They're adapting. There's a greater range of plants and animals consumed, and a greater emphasis on smaller game and even insects during this period. And you'll notice the J point right there. Now the J point looks still kind of like a stem projectile, very similar to the things you'd see during the Folsom and Clovis or even Plainview times. You transition from that into the Bajada phase. Once again, the projectile point hasn't changed very much. They've had a little concave base. One of the main things that shows up in the Bajada phase is the development of complex roasting pits. These, and I believe this one's from Pewaukee Quarter. I think I got this picture from Pewaukee Quarter. You get these kind of elaborate roasting pits because you're dealing with more plant material. Roasting pits, roasting or cooking your food increases caloric intake. It increases how much you can digest, and it leads to an increase in population. This is followed by the San Jose phase. Now we got groundstone coming in, manos and metates. They're starting to process those wild grasses that you see all over the place. The points become smaller, and it's still stemmed with the same concave base, but now it's got these really kind of shoulders to the base. Wild grasses become a dietary staple, and we start to see processing is labor intensive with people forming little base camps and ephemeral villages. If you can remember back to my talk on looking outside of Deming, where we looked at an archaic site during Deming, then these are the first dates for that kind of time period are coming in. In fact, we saw one of these kind of projectile points down there. Then you get into Armijo Phase. This is when corn shows up. So you go from wild grasses to a domesticated plant. It's very, very gradual. While the corn is definitely coming up from Mexico, it's important to note that the projectile points haven't changed very much. These are gradual changes, suggesting in situ adoption instead of migration, large-scale migration and replacement of human beings on the landscape. And then you're going into the Medio Phase. This kind of overlaps, if you use the Oshara tradition, this kind of overlaps with Basket Maker 2 phase in the Four Corners. But we really see the transition during this period from hunter and gatherer to agriculturalist. And it really correlates the later period of it, the end of the Medio Phase, really hits upon a major drought in the American Southwest. So we can see these shifts happening, really good surplus is being stored at this point. So they're agriculturalists creating a surplus. And how do we know that? We start seeing bell-shaped pits. Bell-shaped pits are these kind of pits that are dug underground, and they make a shape kind of like that. And they usually store grains in them. And oftentimes they'll create a fire in them to harden the earth around them, give it that kind of fire-hardened shape to kind of prevent rodents from getting in there, make it less easy for things to get in there, also to stabilize the walls. Then they'll put their materials in there. And then by the end, you have Trujillo Phase in the Four Corners, and you have the introduction of pottery. You have perhaps the introduction of the bow and arrow. It's a little later in the Rio Grande area, but out in the Four Corners, we're looking at the bow and arrow coming in at this point. And certainly by this point in the Trujillo Phase, we have year-round habitation in Pueblo pit house villages. So over the course of the Archaic period, specifically as defined by the Oshara tradition, you can see a clear change towards agriculture in Native American peoples. Now that change is different where you look. What I gave you is a very clear example from the Four Corners. It's a little more difficult here in the Albuquerque area. And in fact, Matt Schmader, who I think is giving a talk for the Albuquerque Archaeological Site, goes into the Archaic in the Albuquerque area in great detail. But the Jemez people, you have to remember that we think for the most part, they are a Four Corners people, and that this would have been their narrative, their transition, as it were, to agriculture, potentially. So what is Pueblo agriculture? Well, ostensibly, it's very variable. So anytime you hear Pueblo agriculture, first thing you should do is question it. Nowadays, if you're talking about modern Pueblo agriculture, yes, it's pretty close to the same at every Pueblo. There's variation, but the overall trend is the same. If we're talking pre-contact, prehistorically amongst Pueblo peoples, it's very, very different. But usually it's centered around perennial streams, perennial or ephemeral streams, and these include, your perennial waterways or your rivers and creeks. Your ephemeral streams are your arroyos and your washes. So a perfect example of your more ephemeral agriculture is out by Chaco Canyon. And usually the agriculture, while it varies, is focused on three major products: corns, beans, and squash, though there's also widespread planting of cotton and sunflowers. And then archaeological features, you have everything from waffle gardens, which Eldon did a great video on recently on how to build your own waffle garden in your backyard. I think he's going to be doing some updating photos soon. You got your grid gardens, you got your mulch gardens. Yes, all three of those things are separate things, but they can be done in conjunction with one another. You've got check dams, small ditches, field houses, and more. There's lots of features associated with agricultural production on the archaeological record. When you're talking about Pueblo peoples and agriculture, it's important to say farmers first, but hunting and gathering continues. Pueblo peoples were not pure agriculturalists. They were farmers that hunted and gathered. Similarly, there are other groups, for example, maybe in the Great Basin, you might talk about hunters and gatherers who farm. They do some farming in addition to hunting and gathering. So there isn't always a clear distinction between the two. In fact, it's shades of gray, as it is with everything else in life. There were a lot of important wild plants to Pueblo, and still important to Pueblo people. Those include things like four-winged saltbush, ground cherry, pinon, prickly pear, globe mallow. Also, some grasses were used into the agricultural period. There was also a shift, as we talked about in earlier lectures, towards garden hunting or rabbit hunting, this idea that you focus on killing the critters in your fields, the cottontails, the jackrabbits. And fish was, especially in the Rio Grande area, fish was a huge potential resource for indigenous peoples. Some indigenous peoples historically have had taboos on consuming fish, but many more do not. There's also things, and I'm putting this out here as a potential source of research. One of the things I've gotten real interested in, you notice I talked about them eating turtles in the lecture on the Archaic Endemic. Recently, up until recently, whenever I read something about spadefoot toads showing up in the archaeological record, I used to think, well, those are creatures that burrowed into the archaeological deposits and then just never came back up. They died, and that's how they get in there. They might have, but they may have also been consuming those amphibians. There's a lot of things that that you might first rule out. In fact, the main reason I've got so interested in spadefoot toads is I've told myself I'm going to take my kids frog gigging in the next week or two to eat some frog legs. And the only thing I was concerned with is you can kill bullfrogs in New Mexico. There's no bag limit because they're invasive and they're problematic. In fact, you can go hunt them in the Bosque del Apache, which is where I was thinking about going. But spadefoot toads they secrete a poison on their back. So I was wondering if you could eat a spadefoot toad without getting sick. So that's where that actually came from as far as, but you should be thinking about these things. There's lots of different materials that maybe today you look at it and you go, oh my God, nobody would eat that. They may have it. It may have been an important resource. And some of those things have been lost to time, but certainly there's a lot of small game that were very important to Pueblo peoples. There were also domesticated animals. And just going over this briefly, turkeys. Turkeys were the big one. We don't have so much evidence in the American Southwest for the consumption of dogs. The big difference with turkeys, and this is where I go, turkeys are primarily taken for their feathers. You can in fact see some Miriam's turkeys on the side of the road down there. How do you know they're Miriam's? You can look at the tail feathers on them. That you notice their tail feathers are white as opposed to the kind of caramel colored tips you get on the tail feathers of Rio Grande turkeys. Miriam's are the mountain turkeys. Rio Grande turkeys are the kind of the bottom river guys. In fact, if you go out to Coronado today, what you're going to see is Rio Grande turkeys, whereas if you go to Jemez, you're going to see Miriam's. They were primarily taken for their feathers, though unlike macaws, they weren't buried with a sense of, and if you're wondering what that picture is in the right-hand corner, those are turkey pens from Paki, Maine, that you're looking at to give you an idea of what a turkey pen actually looks like in the archaeological record. In the American Southwest, they're usually not this formalized, but Paki Maine is kind of a special case and is really a special site for the Southwest as a whole, and an important site in many, many different ways. But the turkey, unlike the macaw, wasn't buried with reverence. It appears to, sometimes at least, it appears to have been consumed after it died or moved on. It's also possible, some people have suggested the production of eggs may have also been used in consumption as well. That's harder to prove, but certainly is there as far as research goes. I certainly wouldn't think you would not. I mean, we know Native American peoples consumed birds' eggs. There's no reason they wouldn't have consumed turkey eggs unless the turkeys were so valuable as a source that it was better to just try to see how many you could get to live than it was to cull the number down per se with the eggs. I don't know the answer to that. So back to the Jemez Mountains. They're relatively heavily forested. It's a supervolcano. If you don't know this, the Jemez Mountains is a supervolcano. I'm not the person to give a geology talk on the Jemez Mountains, but it's one class lower than Yellowstone. So it's still a supervolcano, but it's a little bit smaller than Yellowstone. The volcanic activity forces water to the surface, creating numerous streams and hot springs throughout the mountains. And the ash flows of this supervolcano, which are these giant mesas you see in this image, have been incised by hydraulic erosion. So those streams, that bubbling of water to the surface, has cut down through these earlier ash flows and created these large flat mesas. It's a poor choice for farming, at least in terms of the mountains as a whole. It's a terrible place for farming. The higher elevation dramatically decreases the average temperature. There's fewer frost-free days. The narrow valleys are susceptible to flash flooding. There's poorly developed soil. In fact, If you've ever lived in the Midwest, what we would call soil here in the American Southwest is laughable. It's just not really soil. It's sediment, but it's not soil. And the forested landscape is almost impossible to clear and establish large fields. With all that, why farm there, right? And yet we have some of the earliest evidence of agriculture in New Mexico in the Jemez Mountains at Jemez Cave. If you don't know where Jemez Cave is, first of all, I'm not advocating for the visiting of Jemez Cave. It is not open to the public. Do not go up there. But if you want to take a picture from afar, you can stand at Soda Dam and take a picture of Jemez Cave. It's right on the mountain, the ridge side above you. And it has agriculture or evidence dating back to about 1000 BC. So that early period in which agriculture is coming into the American Southwest. Mind you, it doesn't have that evidence because it was the only place agriculture was going on. What it has is it's a dry cave site, which allows for the preservation of these materials into the present day. It looks like Jemez, these are hunters and gatherers that supplemented their diet with some agriculture down on the floodplain. In fact, if you just go up from Soda Dam and you look at it today, Picuris they own the land right across from Jemez Historic Site. But if you go up just to Soda Dam and you look north, the Picuris own another set of property, which is really down in this flat area. That flat area is created because Soda Dam causes the area to just kind of, it slows the water down. So when it floods, it just kind of makes this low-lying, what would have originally been like a little marshland. And while it was marginal, you could farm there, and you could, on a good year, you could support a couple, maybe a family or two on the yields of that. Those are the people who lived in Jemez Cave. So you're not talking hundreds of people. You're probably talking no more than a dozen people living in that cave in year-round at least. Now, many people probably went up to the Jemez Mountains to hunt and gather during the different seasons for a variety of different products. But as far as agriculture goes, it just really isn't hopping. Mostly what Native American people, the early use of the Jemez Mountains is all associated with hunting and gathering, and specifically the acquisition of obsidian and pedernalture. You can see the obsidian field. I think I showed this picture last time. The highland prairie and forests are ideal for large game. There's a reason why elk do so good in the caldera today. It's because it's an ideal environment for them. Unfortunately, those elk the elk that existed during Pueblo times were hunted to extinction. The elk we have today are Colorado migrants. But the lower elevation areas certainly have abundant pinon trees and edible wild grasses. They're also great areas to take small game at, great resources in there. And these obsidian and pedernalture, these flakestone materials, were ideal for hunters and gatherers. They were they can be traded, they can be worked into any number of tools. Just really good resources to for people who don't have access to metal products. This is the best you're going to get. Obsidian is sharp beyond compare, and pedernal is sturdier than obsidian, but is amongst the easiest to work because it's a chalcedony, easiest to work of cherts for flakestone production. Just really good materials. In fact, not only do you have people coming up from the south, I did an entire project, and many people have talked about this. Pretty much, there was a huge migration pattern from the northern Jemez Mountains all the way up into the San Luis Valley during the Archaic Period of hunters and gatherers. And that San Luis Valley, that southern portion of Colorado out by Alamosa, had everything from bison to elk and was just a summer paradise for these folks. But they all wintered along the Rio Chama. So for thousands of years, the Native American peoples would hang out in the summer around the Great Sand Dunes and then boogie on back to Espanola and Abiquiu for the winter. Okay, so by about 1200, Jemez Mountains is pretty unpopulated. There's probably less than 1,000 people in the Jemez Mountains by 1200 AD. There may have been some pit house villages Interestingly enough, the suspected location at 1200 AD of one of those pit house villages is Jemez Historic Site. However, because of the way the valley's situated, it's very likely that's where the village was. We have absolutely zero, and I can't stress this enough. It's a great story, and I've seen it repeated in people's archaeologist notes. I've seen it repeated in the literature. We have zero, it's very possible that it's there, but we have zero evidence of it there. But most people suspect that it is there. It'd be interesting at some point if we ever found it. Of course, that would mean digging under the village of Gisela, looking for those earlier pit houses. But it could be there. And these follow your floodplain agriculture peoples. These are not the expertise that I'm necessarily talking about. At this time, these people probably followed agricultural patterns similar to the people of Kuaua. They used the Jemez River, which was very small and couldn't support a big population, and they farmed as much as they could in the valley. And when it failed to produce any crops because they got a cold snap, they just traded obsidian and hides with people further down on the river. They were probably ethnic Tiwas, which is fine. It's just the Tiwa form of agriculture at that time period couldn't capitalize on the Jemez Mountains. And then something changed. We mentioned this last time in terms of the coalition period. Locally, this is known as the Vallecitos phase. And I'm going to use that specifically for this talk because during the Vallecitos phase, the Jemez arrive, or the Jemez form, or whatever you want to think of. Probably some Four Corners people migrated into the valley and mixed with the existing Tiwish population. So I don't think there was like a big war where they chased them out or anything like that. I think they all intermarried, which is why I think the Jemez are both Four Corners people and Rio Grande peoples, in why I talk about that. But their language, their culture, their pottery styles may all come from the Four Corners. And these are likely the descendants of the Largo Gallina area. And they settle, as we talked about last time, under the sign of the eagle, which you can see here in this photo. And they occupy the existing villages, but they also create their new villages along the valleys and lower terraces. So when they come in, they initially start practice agriculture just like the Tiwa did. Probably because they're new to the area and they don't know. Just like, remember, you start with meats and you work your way up to vegetarian entrees because you can eat most meats, you don't know you can eat most vegetables. Same thing, where the animals are pretty much going to be, and if you kill them, you can eat them. You're not sure where things are going to grow. You have to experiment for a while. This experimental phase of agriculture in the Jemez province is known as the Vallecitos phase. So Vallecitos phase farming the villages have to remain small. They can't do large-scale agricultural production in those valleys. They're really narrow. In fact, this is the Guadalupe. It's the Guadalupe River. You can see here, none of the valley is actually this far up is suitable for agriculture. You're in a narrow canyon, which is the perfect place for a flash flood to develop. So you have to focus. They hit their population limit, as it were. So these Vallecitos farmers realize that if they're ever going to bring their Four Corners kind of population levels up, they have to figure out a different way. And they do. That's the beauty of it. So around 1350 AD, the landscape changes immensely, 1325. You get into what they call Jemez phase. And Jemez phase farming, they jump right from those valleys up onto the top of the mesas. It's dramatic, and I'm not saying it's overnight, but once it works and they figure it out, they push it to the limit very quickly. So you see a rapid expansion of what at this point is classic Jemez culture, culture and agriculture. So riverine horticulture is replaced with dispersed dry farming on top of the mesas. So you can know, once you go up onto the mesas, you have no way to irrigate your fields with the rivers. Your dry farming means you're only using rainfall. And most of these villages are actually located away from perennial water sources. So they're not looking to be near streams. They're looking specifically for a couple attributes that we're going to talk about in the next slide. But the population quickly rises, possibly to as high as 30,000, but more realistically, 6,000 to 8,000 people. And in essence, The Jemez Mountains transforms between 1325 to 1700 as the breadbasket of the Pueblo world. How do they do it? So how it all works. This isn't the greatest map, and in fact, this is a map I use in publications. But the thing you'll notice about this, we looked at this last time in terms of Jemez province. You'll notice it's not everywhere where there's agriculture. There's a certain, they don't expand agriculture throughout the Jemez Mountains. Rather, it's a very specific portion of the Jemez Mountains which is available to agriculture. First of all, they figure out that the annual rainfall in the Jemez Mountains is adequate to grow the kind of crops they want to grow. So the type of corn that has been developed in the Jemez Mountains by these Jemez peoples, it can grow just off the limited rainfall the mountains get, which in the Jemez Mountains, in all fairness, the Jemez Mountains get more rain than the Rio Grande, than the Albuquerque area. So they're working with a little more to begin with that kind of offsets that need for floodplain working. But they also realize that these mesotops are large pieces of flat land that don't get flash floods. So the river valleys, which are really problematic, you never know. If it rains really bad, even though you want the rain, it destroys all your crops. But these mesotops, even if it rains really bad, the water drains off them right away. You don't have to worry so much about your crops being washed off. Also, whether they recognize this in a scientific fashion or not, cold air sinks and hot air rises. You actually have more frost-free days on these mesotops than you do down in the valleys, which means corn grows better on the mesotops than it does in the valleys below. Moreover, the temperature at night is more stable on those mesotops. So you don't, not only do you get you get more frost-free days, the average temperature on top of those mesotops is actually much better. It's much more regulated. It's much more stable. Plants love these kinds of things. Moreover, the last thing is, all the mesas they plant on, they don't plant on every mesa. They plant on only those mesas that are south-facing. These are the ones that receive the most sunshine per day and per year. Very important. There are some obstacles. So how do they deal with the obstacles? It's still forested, right? Well, you can't cut down, well, you can, but you need lots and lots of people and a willpower beyond any society we've ever seen in the American Southwest. You're not going to deforest the Jemez Mountains. But they didn't have to. In fact, they did the opposite. So old growth ponderosa, there are only about 20 trees per acre. And if you look at this picture here, which kind of gives you an idea what that might look like, you'll notice it's got a couple trees, but then there's grass all in between it. So they didn't cut down the trees, they just farmed among the trees. And there was enough sunshine coming down between those trees for their crops to plant. And the poor soil requires the land to lay fallow for a long time, but that actually worked to their advantage. What they do is they take that fallow land and that becomes their hunting and gathering areas. So they're rotating around on the landscape, planting every couple of years, but they're also hunting and gathering in those areas laying fallow. So those areas are still utilized to produce food. They're just used to produce wild plants and to capture their game. They also, even though we tend to focus on the large villages, they decide that because they have to bring large amounts of areas under agricultural production to make this work, they're not going to live in villages year-round. Instead, they're going to develop lots and lots of field houses so that they'll live all dispersed on the landscape around their respective fields. And they will come in when they can to these large villages, but most of the time they're going to spend it in these field houses. If you have a bad year, what do? Well, hunting and gathering helps offset that, as does the trade. As long as you control access to those obsidian and those flake stone materials, the obsidian, your pedernal, you have some good trade goods that outsiders want. So you have a system that can work, and we see this in the archaeological record. This system is very, very, very successful for the Jemez people. And if you don't know, the picture above that looks like a cluster of rocks that doesn't seem to look like anything, that's what a field house looks like in the archaeological record. Down below, That is your typical mule deer. So that's what you primarily hunt. So the Spanish arrive, still during the Jemez phase. I showed this slide last time. The only thing I've dressed it up with here is I want to talk about, and I just want to mention this in passing primarily, but the Jemez phase lasts till about 1700. So all of these Spanish expeditions and these early colonies really exist within the Jemez phase. Not much changed in the Jemez Mountains with these time periods. And it's also, I present them here in this fashion also to challenge your notion of Coronado coming in, exploring New Mexico, the narrative that Coronado comes in, he explores New Mexico, and then Oñate founds a colony. If you'll notice, the Coronado expedition is bookmarked on both sides by other expeditions into New Mexico. Moreover, the Oñate colony is the second failed attempt at a colony in New Mexico. So we have the Sosa colony in 1590 to 1591, which was illegal, but was there for a year. They're actually the ones who named the Rio Grande the Rio Grande. They're also the ones who started, well, they were slavers, but they also started mining in the Cerrillos Hills. The Oñate colony, and that was failed because the Spanish authorities came up and arrested all of them. And they arrested them for not only starting an illegal colony, but for being, for Judaizing, for practicing Jewish practices. The second one was the Oñate colony. Of course, that failed. Oñate decided that the Spanish settlers would be big encomenderos. They would have large amounts of Indians granted to them, and they would live off the labor of the indigenous peoples. That didn't turn out so well, leading to the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 and the failure of that colony. And it's not until de Vargas comes up and resettles or reconquers New Mexico between 1692 and 1694 that we have a successful, long-lasting Spanish colony, in New Mexico. And that colony is very successful. De Vargas was both a brilliant militarily and brilliant administrator in some ways. I use those terms loosely because his brilliance involved forcing people to comply, both Spaniards and Native Americans, with his ideas. In fact, his main thing was he was trying to petition not to, he wanted a better lot for himself. Than he didn't like New Mexico that much, but he died here and he's buried here. So be it, right? But de Vargas was able to establish the first permanent colony in New Mexico. Well, we'd like to say Oñate established the permanent colony. It's very important to note there are 12 years in which the Spanish were not there. So Oñate's colony really didn't work. In fact, the fact that de Vargas has to rebuild Santa Fe from a Native American pueblo and turn it into a Spanish village again suggests that the village Oñate had established really hadn't lasted past the Pueblo Revolt. In Jemez, this is our mission period. There are a lot of different, once again, lots of missions in the Jemez Mountains, but the one we tend to focus on today is, of course, the one in San Jose at Jemez Historic Site, which is, of course, the most beautiful and most impressive. If you go to the other missions or the perceived location of the other missions, they're not very impressive. But with the Spanish, we get a lot of new plants and animals. What do we get? We get apples, chicken, chili. Chili is something from central Mexico. It really wasn't planted in the American Southwest in any real numbers until the Spanish come up. It wasn't popular. In fact, it wasn't like, we have great archaeological evidence now of the consumption of chocolate as a prestige item. Chili wasn't a prestige item. It didn't really make a big hit in the American Southwest until those mestizos and indigenous peoples of central Mexico came up to colonize in the 17th century. But you get things like pigs. Pigs don't really do well in the American Southwest, but you do get some. Ornamental roses come up during that time period. I specifically point out ornamental roses because we know there was a rose garden at Jemez Mission. We don't know if it was ornamental roses. It was probably wild roses, but I could just picture having this beautiful garden of ornamental roses. It just, was an amazing sign of heaven on earth. And then when they burned that mission, they burned that rose garden down to the ground. But, teach his own. Watermelon, another thing that comes up. Wheat, etc. There's a lot more. Other items that we don't think of. We talk a lot about plants and animals, but things that make your life completely different. One of the things we see is acequias. So while there might have been ditches built by Pueblo peoples in the Rio Grande and elsewhere during the pre-contact period, acequias represent a large regional integrated agricultural system on a scale that is enormous. If you look at the major acequia madres today throughout the state, they are big labor-intensive projects, and those really come in. Those kind of agricultural adaptations come in with the Spanish. Carts and wagons are a big thing. Glassware, hornos for baking bread. So we see a Native American woman. I don't remember if this woman, she's probably from Jemez Public, but you start getting bread when you have ovens. Maiolica, so different types of ceramics are coming in. Metal tools, including steel plowshares, etc. These things also had a dramatic change. In the Jemez Mountains, these items, there are only a few items that were widely accepted. The big ones, if you want to know, the big one as far as accepting is sheep and goats. And I should say sheep or goats, because finding the difference between a sheep and a goat in the archaeological record is almost impossible. But we know they had them. In fact, the Jemez Mountains had domesticated animals existed prehistorically in the Jemez Mountains. It's possible the Jemez would have developed into more akin to nomadic pastoralists than agriculturalists. The Jemez Mountains, in fact, a lot of the mountains of northern New Mexico are ideal for sheep herding. And sheep and goats are obviously not important just for their meat, but they also have an important trade item that's wool. And both the types of goats and the fur of the animals are really good. So in the Jemez Mountains during this time, one of the things that's been argued that you can really see, to see the association, you see spindle whorls like this Jemez black on white spindle whorl that you see above, but you also see a change in those field houses that are everywhere. All of a sudden, there appear to be a lot more two-room field houses. And most people have suggested, including myself, believe that these were associated with, you still have the one room you live in, these one-room structures which the family lives in or the men live in when they're out working the fields. But the second room is the room your animals live in. So it's a thought that these two-room structures probably aren't a change in familial structure or layout of the Jemez people. What they represent is now you have domesticated animals sharing that farm space with human beings. So they're out in those fields, but they also, in addition to having, and once again, the system still works. Those areas you're laying fallow, if you don't hunt and gather in them, they're ideal for the grazing of livestock. So this system actually, these sheep and goats get integrated into society like that. Like a Spaniard brings up sheep and goats, the Jemez, he explains, well, this is what we do with these animals. The Jemez, of all the things, they go, we can easily take this on and make it part of our own. And they do. But it's all not to last, right? You have resistance. This is actually the focus of our next talk in the series is resistance. And in Jemez, we've got lots of resistance. We have upheaval probably in 1601. We have the burning of the mission at San Jose in 1623, probably part of the Jemez Civil War. We have the Jemez and Apache insurrection, or as I talked about, this is one of the first times you hear the word Navajo. It's interesting because the Navajo aren't living in some remote corners of the earth. They're actually living on Virgin Mesa when this claim is made. So it's rebellious Apache peoples living right above Gisela. It's not like they're living someplace different. In fact, they're living in a Pueblo village. So go figure. Then, of course, your later Pueblo revolts. Disease, why do we see a population decline in the 17th century, the end of the Jemez phase? Disease, migration, and warfare. We talked about these last time in great detail. By 1706, the population's gone way down. And the Jemez people are forced out of the mountains. Somebody's asking what the Jemez Civil War is about. So I should note, if we go back a slide really quickly, 2 slides, that according to the Spanish archives, the Jemez Revolt of 1623 was not a revolt. It's referred to as the Jemez Civil War. It's referred to by Benavides as the time in which the Jemez people, the terrible non-Christian Jemez peoples, killed the Christian Jemez peoples. and that over 3,000 of their population dies in a civil war. Now, well, Benavides reports this to both the King of Spain and the Pope in Rome, and his conversion and time in New Mexico is rewarded with him drowning on his way to India, where he promotes himself. I'm sure we'll talk about this more. If you read between the lines, I have every reason to question the idea that it was a Jemez civil war. Certainly Jemez may have fought on either side of the war, but I think it's more appropriate to call it a religious rebellion against the Spanish, and specifically against the missionaries at San Jose or Gisela. And once again, we'll talk about this in the next lecture, but what I would like to say here is I tend to, yes, it is the Civil War. If you read the accounts, it's viewed as more of a civil war. Realistically, I think it's a revolt. The Jemez are forcibly taken out of the mountains, and they're concentrated below in an area known as Balatoa, or village in the valley. And the Jemez Mountains are forcibly abandoned. The Spanish keep them from resettling in the Jemez Mountains. Well, the Jemez Valley, where they are today, where the Jemez people are today, doesn't have those large flat mesas. Instead, it has a valley that's suitable for acequia agriculture. So what you see in the Walatoa phase, starting around 1700, is a shift to more of a what we would call modern day Pueblo style of agriculture. It can't support, once again, the Jemez Valley can't support a large amount of agriculture, which it didn't. Remember, they're down to 300 people. They can farm in the little valley and be just fine. And it takes on aspects of Spanish or Mexican agriculture, including the use of acequia. So we see acequias developed during this time. We also see the growing, the production of chili starting during the 1700s in the Jemez Valley, and wheat probably to some extent. We also, the Jemez, who had always been, and Dean Wilson, who is a ceramicist for the Office of Archaeological Studies, has often used this term to kind of refer to the Guyana and the Jemez as the mountain Anasazi, the mountain peoples, which I don't think is a very, me personally, I don't look at it as an offensive word because I know he says it with pride. And they were really these kind of mountainous people that did agriculture, but they were also hunters and gatherers and warriors and kind of a real rugged people that consumed a lot more deer. You know, I would almost imagine like the Jemez people being viewed almost more like mountain men. They're maybe a little rough around the edges, but they certainly, they're the guys you want on your side if you're going to war and stuff like that. Well, a lot of those practices, that hunting of large game, that hunting and gathering mountains, because it's so restricted, we start to see a focus on things like rabbit hunting. In fact, this is a cacique. I want to say his name was, no, I'm sorry, he's not a cacique. He's an artist. He's Vizal Casquito. In fact, he's one of the early 20th century artists that we featured in a Native American art exhibit, which was on display at Coronado for several years, I believe, and it was on display at Jemez up until recently. A wonderful artist in the early 20th century tradition. Jemez culture during this time period starts in mirror Pueblo culture elsewhere. In fact, the big travesty is that when we talk about Pueblo peoples, indigenous peoples in the American Southwest as a whole, prior to Spanish contact, there is an immense amount of variation. And there's still quite a bit of variation today, but outwardly today, we see a kind of a blurring of lines. We see peoples starting to resemble more and more like each other than perhaps in the past they wouldn't necessarily. And it's important to recognize that each Pueblo group, whether it's Jemez, whether it's Santa Ana, whether it's Santo Domingo or Kewa, they all had their own unique cultures prehistorically and still do today, but a lot of those differences have been toned down, unfortunately, because of Spanish control. So here's some food for thought. This is where I'm going to end before I answer any more questions. Pueblo people were great farmers. The Jemez clearly showed that they were amazing farmers and demonstrated expertise and ingenuity in the traditional agricultural practices on a level you just can't believe. And I think this is an important lesson in fact, in highlighting these differences amongst the Jemez people, because we're always talking about sustainability, especially in the American Southwest. How much water do we have? How much is the climate going to change? It's probably inevitable. Our population continues to increase at an alarming rate. How do we feed all these people? And really, in the case of the Jemez, I think it's worth noting that sustainability really starts with an understanding of the environment which surrounds us. And the Jemez really did understand that environment and still do today. In fact, there is a term used by the Forest Service. I think this really sums up all Native American indigenous peoples throughout the United States and elsewhere. They have what we call TEC, or traditional ecological knowledge. And this knowledge of the environment was developed over thousands of years of living in that environment. And today, when we use science and we use these Western approaches to it, but in many times it takes us years and years and years of Western science to come up with the same answer that indigenous peoples have known for generations. They may have known it in a different way, but this is the perfect example. So whereas I've shown scientifically why Jemez agriculture works, they learn that through their own experimentation, through their own ideas and insights into that environment through time. But with that, I will open it up for questions. But I thank you very much. This is a historic picture of Walato, which I really like. This is actually a picture on display upstairs at the offices at Jemez Historic Site. And most Jemez government officials that visit us love to take a look at this picture and try to place everything on the plaza. Because if you look, you can see the kivas. And if you can figure out where the kivas are, you can figure out where people's houses are today. But the beauty of it, the one thing I like to point out with it, the thing that I don't think a lot of people see, that is the antithesis of traditional agricultural practices. If you really want to get down to it, it's all chili that's hanging up in the plaza, which is cool. But but the place where that village is located, the crops being grown, that is all a result of Spanish colonization and Spanish forced changes to the Jemez people in the 1700s. So it's both beautiful. It's a historic photo, but in many ways, when I look at it, and I think in terms of archaeologically what the Jemez people, their culture had been prior to contact, their traditional culture, that's not illustrating the uniqueness of the Jemez people. But it's a cool picture. It's a really cool picture. Okay, I will stop sharing, and you can unmute yourselves and ask questions.
Well, I have a question, Matt. If the people waited for the water to water the crops, what did they do for drinking water? And what did they do for, if they bathed, what did they do for washing kind of water?
Oh, okay. Well, actually, this is a good question. I'm gonna give you two answers. One, they probably did some water catchment on the mesa tops. So they probably had, they had reservoirs at some of the pueblos, like Coahuila, I think, has a very large Hayward's on. So he could probably, if I remember correctly on our paper at Coahuila, I'm pretty sure there's a large reservoir at that village for collecting water.
Yes.
But in addition to that, I would point out in the words of Joe Sando, the historian for Jemez People, this really gets into the tradition of the Jemez people being some of the greatest runners in human history. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you're up on Amajuqua, on Virgin Mesa, you're on top of Virgin Mesa, and you need water, it's a long hike down to the Rio Jemez to go get that water, and then you've got to bring it up for all your family members who possibly can't go down and get that water, which is probably why you see this huge tradition of running and hiking amongst the Jemez people, which is still going on today. It's a wonderful tradition that's still going on today. So both answers. They probably collected water on the mesa tops for drinking, but then also when it was dry, they just went down to the river and got it. It's a hike, but you can do it, especially if you're in good shape. In fact, the hike from what I call Amajuqua, so you got to understand, you get into a complication. What archaeologists call Amajuqua, Jemez people call Tavaqua, and what Jemez people call Tavaqua, the archaeologists call Amajuqua. Does that make sense? So they got the names reversed. So archaeologically, Virgin Mesa Ruid is Amajuqua to archaeologists, and to the Jemez people, it's Tavaqua. But it doesn't matter. It's a beautiful hike up to that village from Jemez Historic Site, right up the mesa top. There is an old road that used to go up there. Nowadays, it comes close to where the Pueblo is. Nowadays, it's just a hiking trail, but it's very beautiful. In fact, I use the trail. I don't take people up there very often, but one of the things I often point out from there is once you get about halfway up to the top of Virgin Mesa, you can actually look down at Gisela, the San Jose Pueblo, and see all the Pericletes land. And if you look, there's these little kind of like flat areas in the little Christian retreat center that's there now. So they have their little houses, and then they'll have these little flat areas in between the houses. All the little casitas are on top of the room blocks, and what you're looking at is the plazas of Gisela Pueblo, or what appears to be the plazas of Gisela Pueblo. So you can actually look at, wow, the village, because we only have a small section at Jemez Historic Site today. You can really appreciate just how big Gisela Village was in its heyday. Very, very large. Other questions?
Pottery comment, of course. There was a lot of trade and exchange uphill, downhill between the Rio Grande Pueblos, including Kuaua, and the Jemez area. As we talked about, you mentioned our article, like, 2 or 3 years ago in the S&M volume that talks about pottery at Coahuila. But, people trade something for something, and there was a lot of uphill, downhill trade and commerce going on. And, when we talked about all that glazeware that was being produced at Kuaua for about 400 years, a lot of that pottery was also traded up into the Jemez very regularly over several hundred years. And I was thinking today, as you were talking, what did they exchange for that? I mean, you don't get something for nothing, right? Well, the upland products of the Jemez that might have been desirable is, of course, number one, obsidian. But in addition, the game animals,
Yep, exactly.
the deer and elk of the upland environment could be traded down to places like Zia first, and then downstream on the Jemez to Kuaua, because those kinds of animals didn't exist down there. They certainly didn't by that time, because if they were there at all, they'd been eliminated hundreds of years prior to that. So there were some very desirable things up in the Jemez that could have been used at Kuaua, and in return they said, here, we'll give you some pretty pottery, or perhaps things in the pottery as well.
I think you
correspondence going both ways.
Well, and I think you also, hitting upon that, I think one of the other things you see in this trade is that many years that were probably ideal for Jemez for dry farming, years where you get a lot of rainfall that probably caused the lowlands to flash flood. The Rio Grande, before Cochiti Dam was built, could really flash flood a lot. So what you might have also had is a buffering strategy by both groups. Years that Jemez did really good for agriculture were probably years the Rio Grande didn't do so well, and vice versa.
Yeah.
That may have
a symbiotic relationship,
precisely
uphill, downhill.
And I think that the key highway of that trade, per se, as you kind of mentioned, with the way it's going across villages, is really the Jemez River. So that becomes your lifeblood, connecting the people of the Jemez Mountains with the people of the Middle Rio Grande or Rio Abajo region.
Yep, that was the route, definitely. I mean, you've got Kuaua, you've got Old Santa Ana, and you've got Zia, all along that route. And Zia was definitely the jumping off point for that trade as it went up into the Jemez. But that was in existence, that kind of interchange for several hundred years, I believe, based on the pottery that we found at Coahuila. Certainly glaze D and E, very strong trade going back and forth.
Yeah.
So there's pottery.
Yeah. It's also a pitch to read Hayward and Hayward wrote most of it, but Hayward and I's article on Coahuila Pueblo. If you want another one of those 400 articles written by Matt Barber, along with the beautiful recipe of Nat's meatballs, beans, and peaches, which I will never let.
When was it? ASNM volume about 3 years ago, I think.
Yeah, we could probably email somebody the link to that if they really want it. I
got
don't
the
know.
article. If anybody wants it, I can send you a copy of it.
There you go. Hit up Hayward. he did. I'll be honest. Hayward is a great ceramicist, and he's more. I offered some background information and probably some emotional support, but outside of that, Hayward's really the ceramic guy.
I'm just narrowly focused.
All right.
It's
Well,
nice
hey,
to see
Matt.
everybody.
Sorry, go ahead, Gail.
Why would consuming fish have been taboo?
So the short answer is that's a good question that I
Gotcha.
don't know. So it is taboo. So like for example, the mescalero, really weird. So when I talked about the hunting article, we talked about the hunting PowerPoint. I think I mentioned I used High Rolls Cave as an example. Modern day mescalero don't eat fish, and the people at High Rolls Cave in the Archaic Period didn't seem to eat fish in that area. Now that's in southeastern New Mexico, but there were certain groups that for whatever reason didn't eat fish. I don't know the reasons for that. I know, if I take it to a European perspective, I know kosher doesn't allow the eating of fish that don't have scales, for example. So you can't, if you're kosher, you can't necessarily eat like eels and stuff like that. And I'm not the best to speak to that, but I know there are reasons for those kind of things. And I know people have done some research that said, well, I think with the pigs, it was tied to some disease going through.
Right.
So I don't know. Perhaps it's some sort of traditional ecological knowledge among some groups in some specific areas that there was a reason for not doing that because it could make you sick. But I don't know, and I don't think those taboos extended to the Jemez people by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll put this up on the web probably today. And if you want to look at it again or review things, you can. And it'll be posted on the kuaua.org website within the next couple of days. Okay?
All
So have a good week. We might see you next week at Ask an Archaeologist, or we'll see you in 2 weeks back with Matt.
Sounds good. Have a nice day, guys.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.